The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Redemption Springs, a small but growing settlement nestled in the foothills of the Colorado Rockies. Judge Emmett Hargrove sat behind his imposing oak desk, stroking his silver-streaked beard as he gazed at the young woman standing defiantly before him. His daughter, Eleanor Hargrove, had always been headstrong, but today her blue eyes flashed with a determination that even he found unsettling. "The matter is settled, Eleanor," the judge pronounced, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years on the bench. "This town needs stability and strong alliances if we're to survive the coming railroad expansion. Your marriage to Thomas Wellington will secure the investment we need." He tapped a stack of papers with his gnarled fingers, the documents outlining the arrangement with the Eastern banker's son, who would arrive by stagecoach in 3 days' time. Eleanor's hands balled into fists at her sides, the fine fabric of her dress crinkling under the pressure of her grip. "I won't be traded like cattle to secure your political ambitions, Father," she said, her voice steady, despite the fury building inside her. "I'm 22 years old. Mother would never have allowed this." The mention of her deceased mother hung in the air between them, a wound that had never properly healed for either of them. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to the channel and let us know what city you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Judge Hargrove's face hardened as he rose from his chair, his considerable height allowing him to tower over most men in the territory. "Your mother understood duty, Eleanor, something you've yet to learn." He moved to the window, watching as townspeople bustled about their evening routines. "Wellington's father controls the banking interests that will determine whether the railroad spur reaches Redemption Springs or bypasses us entirely. Without it, this town dies." He turned back to her, his expression softening slightly. "Is your stubborn pride worth the livelihood of every family here?" Eleanor felt the familiar weight of guilt pressing down on her shoulders. Her father had always been skilled at wielding responsibility like a weapon. She gazed out the window at the mountains rising majestically in the distance, their snow-capped peaks catching the last golden rays of sunlight. Somewhere up there, beyond the reach of judges and bankers and railroad men, lived freedom. Her thoughts drifted to the stories she'd heard about a man who dwelled in those mountains, a giant of a man who'd turned his back on civilization years ago. "3 days, Father," Eleanor finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Give me 3 days to accept this fate." She met his gaze with renewed strength. "I deserve at least that much time to say goodbye to the life I thought I would have. The life where she would marry for love, not advantage. The life her mother had often whispered about during bedtime stories." Judge Hargrove nodded curtly, satisfied that he had won the argument as he always did. "3 days, then. But Wellington arrives on Thursday, and you'll be at the station to greet him properly." He reached for his pipe, signaling that their discussion was over. "You'll thank me someday, Eleanor, when your children grow up in prosperity instead of a dying town." Eleanor left her father's study without another word, her mind already racing with plans. She wouldn't be meeting any stagecoach on Thursday. By then, she would be long gone. As she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, she caught sight of her reflection in the hallway mirror. The prim and proper daughter of the most powerful man in Redemption Springs stared back at her, but behind her eyes burned the spirit of her mother, a woman who had also once dreamed of escaping the confines of society's expectations. The following morning, Eleanor rose before dawn. She dressed quickly in her simplest riding clothes, sturdy wool trousers she'd had secretly made last winter, a cotton shirt, and a leather vest that had belonged to her older brother before he'd been killed in the war. She braided her long chestnut hair tightly against her head and tucked it under a wide-brimmed hat. From beneath her bed, she pulled out a canvas sack containing provisions, a small amount of money she'd saved, and her mother's journal, the one possession she couldn't bear to leave behind. Miles away, as the first light of dawn painted the mountain peaks in shades of pink and gold, Caleb Morgan was already awake. At 45 years old, his daily routine remained unchanged regardless of season. He rose with the sun, checked his traps, tended to his small herd of goats, and worked his modest vegetable garden. Standing at 6 feet 7 inches tall, with shoulders as broad as an ox yoke, Caleb cut an imposing figure even in the vastness of the mountain wilderness he called home. 15 years in these mountains had weathered his face like tanned leather, lines etched deeply around his eyes from squinting against the harsh mountain sun. His beard, once dark brown, now carried streaks of silver, while his hair hung past his shoulders, often tied back with a strip of rawhide when he worked. The isolation suited him. After what he'd seen during the war, after what he'd done, he had no desire to live among people again. Caleb paused in his work, straightening his back as he scanned the valley below. Something had changed in the air, not a scent or a sound, but a feeling. Years of survival in the wilderness had honed his instincts to a razor's edge. He reached for the Winchester rifle that was never far from his reach and moved to the edge of his property, where a crude fence marked the boundary between his sanctuary and the world below. Through his spyglass, he caught sight of movement on the rarely used mountain trail that wound its way up from the valley. A rider on horseback, moving steadily upward, following a path few travelers ever attempted. Caleb's jaw tightened. In 15 years, he could count on one hand the number of uninvited visitors who had ventured this far. None had been welcome, and none had stayed long. Eleanor guided her horse, Penny, carefully along the steep mountain trail. The sturdy mare had been her companion since childhood, and if anyone could make this journey, it was Penny. They had been climbing steadily since leaving Redemption Springs before first light. Now, with the sun high overhead, Eleanor estimated they must be near their destination. The stories about the mountain hermit were vague on specifics, but most agreed he lived in a high meadow near the tree line, in a cabin built with his own hands. "Just a little farther, girl," Eleanor murmured to her horse, patting the mare's sweaty neck. The air was noticeably thinner here, making both horse and rider work harder for each breath. Eleanor's plan, hastily formed in the desperate hours after her father's ultimatum, now seemed increasingly foolish. What made her think a man who had fled civilization would help her? What if the stories about his gentle nature were wrong? What if he was the monster some claimed? The trail turned sharply around a massive boulder, and suddenly the trees opened up into a sunlit meadow. In the center stood a log cabin, larger than she had imagined, with smoke rising from a stone chimney. A small corral held 3 goats, and nearby, a garden plot showed neat rows of vegetables. It looked almost idyllic, a peaceful homestead far removed from the complications of the world below. Eleanor's momentary appreciation of the scene shattered when she spotted the man standing at the edge of the clearing, a rifle held casually but unmistakably in his direction. Even at this distance, she could see he was enormous. The stories hadn't exaggerated his size. Heart hammering in her chest, she slowly raised her hands to show she carried no weapon. "That's far enough," Caleb called out, his voice rough from disuse. State your business, and then turn around. I don't welcome visitors." He kept the rifle pointed at the ground, a warning rather than an immediate threat. Something about this rider seemed odd to him. Too small for a man, yet dressed in men's clothes. The horse was well-bred, not the type mountain trappers or prospectors typically rode. Eleanor swallowed hard and removed her hat, allowing her braided hair to fall free. "My name is Eleanor Hargrove," she called back, her voice carrying clearly across the meadow. "I've come from Redemption Springs seeking sanctuary." She remained seated on her horse, hands visible, trying to project a confidence she didn't entirely feel. Surprise registered briefly on Caleb's weathered face before he schooled his features back to impassivity. A woman, alone, this far up the mountain? He lowered the rifle slightly, but didn't set it aside. "Hargrove," he repeated, recognition flickering in his eyes. "The judge's daughter?" News traveled even to his isolated home occasionally, brought by the few trappers he traded with. "Yes," Eleanor admitted, seeing no point in lying. "And I need your help, Mr. Morgan." Using his name was a calculated risk. She had heard it mentioned once in hushed tones by old-timers at the general store. By the slight narrowing of his eyes, she knew she had guessed correctly. Caleb studied her for a long moment, weighing options and dangers. Finally, he gestured toward a hitching post near the water trough. "Tie your horse there. She looks thirsty." He didn't move from his position, the rifle still in hand. "Then we'll talk about why the daughter of Judge Hargrove would ride up a mountain to find a man most folks pretend doesn't exist." Eleanor dismounted and led Penny to the water trough, moving slowly and deliberately. Up close, Caleb Morgan was even more imposing than he had appeared from a distance. Standing at least 1.5 feet taller than her own 5 feet 4 inches, with shoulders that seemed to block out the sun, he was every bit the mountain giant described in whispered tales. Yet, as she approached, she noticed his eyes, a clear, intelligent gray that watched her with wariness but not malice. "Thank you for not shooting me on sight," Eleanor said as she approached, attempting a smile despite her nerves. "Or my horse. She's innocent in all this." Her attempt at levity fell flat against Caleb's stony expression. He merely nodded toward the cabin's porch, indicating she should precede him. Eleanor complied, acutely aware of his massive presence behind her. The porch steps creaked under their combined weight as Eleanor took a seat on a hand-hewn bench. Caleb remained standing, the rifle now propped against the wall, but within easy reach. "You're a long way from town, Miss Hargrove," he observed, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. "And I doubt your father knows you're here." There was no question in his statement, just certainty. Eleanor met his gaze directly. "No, he doesn't. And by now, he'll have noticed I'm gone." She squared her shoulders, reminding herself why she had made this desperate journey. "Mr. Morgan, I need to disappear, just for a while, until I can figure out what comes next." The words tumbled out in a rush. "My father is forcing me to marry a stranger, a banker's son from back east. The wedding is arranged for next week, and I had no say in the matter." Caleb's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "And you thought hiding with the mountain hermit was your best option?" There was a hint of incredulity in his tone. "I'm not in the business of sheltering runaway brides, Miss Hargrove, especially not ones whose fathers have the law in their pocket." He crossed his massive arms across his chest. "Judge Hargrove's not a man I care to cross." Eleanor's chin lifted defiantly. I'm not asking for charity. I can work, cook, clean, tend garden. I'm stronger than I look. She gestured toward the cabin and surrounding homestead. And from what I can see, you could use the help. It was a bold statement, bordering on insulting, but Eleanor was desperate. Just until winter. By then, Wellington will have found another bride, and my father will have cooled his temper enough that I can negotiate my own future. Caleb studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he sighed, a sound like wind through pine needles. You have no idea what you're asking, Miss Hargrove. Winter up here isn't like down in the valley. It's harsh, unforgiving. Many days, it's a fight just to survive. He gestured toward the east. First snows already dusted the highest peaks. In a month, this trail will be impassable until spring. I understand the risks, Eleanor insisted, though in truth, she had only the vaguest notion of mountain winters. What I don't understand is why you live up here alone. The stories in town, they say you were once a respected man, but doctor during the war. She watched his face carefully, noting how it hardened at the mention of his past. What made you turn your back on the world, Mr. Morgan? A dangerous stillness came over Caleb, his gray eyes turning to flint. You don't get to ask those questions. His voice was quiet, but carried an edge sharp enough to cut. Not now, maybe not ever. He turned away, gazing out over the valley below, where the town of Redemption Springs was just a collection of tiny buildings from this distance. You should go back, Miss Hargrove. Make peace with your father. The devil you know is better than the one you don't. Eleanor stood, closing the distance between them, despite her instincts screaming caution. I can't go back, not to be sold like property. She drew a deep breath, steeling herself. And if you turn me away, I'll keep going, deeper into the mountains. It was both a promise and a threat, not to him, but to herself. I'd rather take my chances with wilderness than with a life not of my choosing. Something in her words seemed to reach him. Caleb turned back, his expression softening, almost imperceptibly. You have your mother's spirit, he said quietly, catching Eleanor off guard. At her surprised look, he added, This isn't my first encounter with the Hargrove family, though it's been many years. He didn't elaborate further, leaving Eleanor to wonder what connection this mountain hermit could possibly have to her mother. Before she could question him, the distant sound of voices carried up from the trail. Caleb tensed immediately, moving to the edge of the porch with the fluid grace of a much smaller man. He snatched up the spyglass, hanging from a post, and trained it on the lower switchbacks of the trail. 3 riders, he reported, his voice tight. One's wearing a badge. He lowered the glass, fixing Eleanor with an accusing stare. You were followed. It wasn't a question. Eleanor's heart sank. My father must have sent the sheriff after me. She hadn't expected pursuit so quickly. Mr. Morgan, I'm sorry. I never meant to bring trouble to your door. The fear in her voice was genuine, not just for herself, but for the consequences her impulsive actions might bring to this solitary man. Caleb's mind worked rapidly, weighing options. The riders were still at least 30 minutes away, given the steep terrain. Inside, he ordered abruptly, gesturing toward the cabin door. Take only what you need from your saddlebags. I'll handle your horse. When Eleanor hesitated, he added more gently, I'm not turning you in, Miss Hargrove. Not yet, anyway, but we need to move quickly. Relief flooded through Eleanor as she hurried to comply, grabbing her small pack from Penny's saddlebags. Inside the cabin, she was surprised by the unexpected neatness and order. Though sparse, the interior was clean and well organized. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with cooking implements hanging nearby. A solid table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the main room, with not at all the dwelling of a wild man that town gossip had painted. Caleb entered moments later, his movements purposeful. "Your horse is hidden in the back corral, out of sight from the main trail." He moved to a trunk at the foot of his bed, pulling out extra blankets and a small pack. "There's a hunting cabin another 2 miles up," he explained, stuffing the blankets into the pack. "It's little more than a shelter, but it's well hidden. They won't find you there." Eleanor watched him work, confused by his sudden change of heart. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, genuinely puzzled. "A minute ago, you were ready to send me back down the mountain." Caleb paused, something like pain crossing his features, before disappearing behind his usual stoic mask. "I have my reasons," he said simply. "None that concern you." He handed her the pack. "There's dried meat, hardtack, and a water skin inside. Enough for 3 days. Stay there until I come for you. Don't make a fire unless absolutely necessary, and then only at night." The instructions were clear and concise, delivered in a tone that brooked no argument. Yet Eleanor hesitated, unwilling to flee, while leaving this stranger to face the consequences of her actions. "What will you tell them? The sheriff will know someone's been here. My horse left tracks." Caleb's mouth quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Let me worry about that, Miss Hargrove. I've been avoiding unwanted company for 15 years. He moved to a cabinet and removed a pistol, checking it before offering it to her. "Do you know how to use this?" Eleanor took the weapon, her hand remembering the weight and balance from the lessons her brother had given her years ago, before he marched off to war never to return. "Yes," she answered simply, tucking it into her belt. Caleb nodded approvingly. "Good. There's mountain lions up higher, and bears, though they'll likely leave you alone if you don't surprise them." He moved to the back door, checking the position of the sun. "Follow the game trail behind the goat pen. It leads to a stream. Follow the stream uphill until you reach a lightning-struck pine. Can't miss it. Looks like a giant fork. The cabin is another 100 yards past it, tucked against the cliff face." Eleanor committed the directions to memory, then impulsively reached out to touch Caleb's arm. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan." She felt the muscles tense beneath her fingers and quickly withdrew her hand. "I'll repay this kindness somehow." Something unreadable passed through Caleb's gray eyes. "Just stay hidden and stay alive, Miss Hargrove. That'll be payment enough." He gestured toward the back door. "Now go, quickly, and remember, not a sound until I come for you." Sheriff Bill Hollister was not a patient man at the best of times. After a 4-hour ride up a treacherous mountain trail, his patience had worn thinner than the air around them. Alongside him rode Deputy Frank Wilson and Thomas Sullivan, the judge's head ranch hand and sometimes enforcer. The judge had been explicit in his instructions: bring Eleanor home, regardless of her wishes in the matter. "You sure this is the right trail, Sullivan?" Hollister asked, wiping sweat from his brow, despite the coolness of the mountain air. "Ain't seen sign of a horse for the last mile." He was a competent lawman in town, but tracking had never been his strong suit. Sullivan, a hard-faced man with cold eyes, nodded curtly. "This is the only way up to Morgan's place. If the judge's daughter came this way, this is the trail she'd have taken." He didn't add that he had his own reasons for wanting to find the mountain hermit. 15 years ago, Caleb Morgan had broken Sullivan's arm in 3 places during a confrontation in town, a humiliation he had neither forgotten nor forgiven. The trail opened suddenly into a high meadow, revealing Caleb Morgan's homestead. Hollister whistled low. "Well, I'll be damned. The hermit's done all right for himself." He hadn't expected such a well-established property. The cabin was solid and well-maintained. smoke curling lazily from the chimney. A vegetable garden, a small orchard of apple trees, and a goat pen completed the picture of self-sufficiency. As they approached, the cabin door opened, and Caleb Morgan stepped onto the porch. Even from a distance, his imposing size was apparent. He held no weapon, but his stance conveyed a clear message: proceed with caution. Hollister felt a flutter of unease in his stomach. The stories about the mountain giant hadn't been exaggerated. "That's close enough," Caleb called out when they were still 20 yards from the cabin. His deep voice carried easily across the distance. "State your business, Sheriff." He emphasized the title slightly, acknowledging Hollister's badge while making it clear it carried little weight in this remote location. Hollister reined his horse to a stop, signaling the others to do the same. "Morning, Morgan," he called back, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "We're looking for Judge Hargrove's daughter, Eleanor. She went missing from town last night. Trail leads up this way." He gestured vaguely toward the path they had followed. "You seen her?" Caleb crossed his arms over his broad chest, his expression revealing nothing. "I don't get many visitors, Sheriff, and certainly no young ladies from town." His gaze shifted briefly to Sullivan, a flicker of recognition and dislike crossing his features. "You're welcome to look around if you don't believe me, but you won't find her here." Sullivan urged his horse forward, ignoring Hollister's warning glance. "Mind if we water our horses, Morgan? Been a long ride up." Without waiting for permission, he dismounted and led his horse toward the water trough. His eyes scanned the property, searching for any sign of Eleanor or her mount. Caleb remained motionless, though his eyes followed Sullivan's movements with the focus of a predator tracking potential prey. "Help yourself," he said evenly. "Then I suggest you head back to town before the weather turns. Storm's brewing." He nodded toward the western horizon, where dark clouds were indeed gathering. Deputy Wilson dismounted as well, leading his horse to water while maintaining a respectful distance from both Sullivan and Morgan. Unlike the others, Wilson had no personal stake in this mission. He was simply following orders, though he couldn't help but feel they were intruding where they weren't wanted. Sullivan completed a circuit of the cabin, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Horse tracks leading in, but none leading out," he announced, pointing to faint impressions in the hard ground. "Someone rode in here recently, Morgan, and their horse is still here somewhere." His hand moved to rest on the butt of his pistol. "You want to change your story?" Hollister dismounted now, his own hand hovering near his weapon. "Look, Morgan, we don't want trouble. The judge is worried about his daughter. If she's here, or if you know where she went, just tell us. We'll take her home, and that'll be the end of it." Caleb's expression remained impassive, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "Those tracks are 3 days old, Sullivan. A trapper came through to trade furs for some of my corn and potatoes." He gestured toward a small corn patch near the edge of the clearing. "Check for yourself if you don't believe me. You'll find the same tracks leading back down on the North Fork of the trail." Sullivan's face darkened with suspicion and old animosity. "You're lying, Morgan. I know horse sign when I see it, and these are fresh." He took a step closer, his hand now fully on his pistol. "Where is she? In the cabin? Or did you hide her somewhere else when you saw us coming?" The tension in the clearing thickened like the approaching storm clouds. Caleb uncrossed his arms slowly, letting them hang at his sides. Though he made no move toward a weapon, his posture shifted subtly into a fighting stance. "I told you, Sullivan, she's not here. Now I suggest you and your friends leave my property before things get unpleasant." The quiet menace in his voice sent a chill down Hollister's spine. Wilson, sensing the deteriorating situation, stepped between the two men. "Sullivan, back off. We've got no warrant and no proof the girl's here." He turned to Caleb, his manner more diplomatic. "Morgan, I apologize for the intrusion, but you understand our concern. The judge's daughter is missing, and this trail was her most likely route." Caleb's gaze shifted to Wilson, some of the tension leaving his massive frame. "I understand your duty, Deputy, but I haven't seen Judge Hargrove's daughter. It wasn't technically a lie. Eleanor was already gone from the cabin when they arrived." "If I do, I'll be sure to send word down to town." This last was said with a hint of sarcasm that wasn't lost on any of them. Hollister, recognizing the impasse they had reached, made a decision. "All right, we've taken enough of Mr. Morgan's time." He shot a warning glance at Sullivan. "Mount up. We'll check the North Fork Trail on our way down. See if we can pick up any sign there." Sullivan looked ready to argue, but thought better of it when he caught the sheriff's expression. With obvious reluctance, he returned to his horse, shooting one final glare at Caleb. "This isn't over, Morgan," he muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Caleb watched impassively as the three men mounted and turned their horses back toward the trail. Only when they had disappeared into the trees did he allow himself to relax slightly. The confrontation had gone better than expected, but he knew Sullivan would be back. The man had nursed his grudge for 15 years. He wouldn't give up so easily now. Moving quickly, Caleb gathered supplies from the cabin: food, extra ammunition, medical supplies, and warmer clothing. If his suspicions were correct, Sullivan would circle back after separating from Hollister and Wilson. The hunting cabin where he had sent Eleanor wouldn't remain safe for long. They would need to move deeper into the mountains, to places where even experienced trackers would fear to follow. As he worked, Caleb found himself wondering why he had chosen to help Eleanor Hargrove. He had lived alone for so long, deliberately cutting himself off from human connections, and the complications they inevitably brought. Yet something about the young woman's determination had struck a chord within him. Perhaps it was the echo of her mother he had glimpsed in her eyes, Sarah Hargrove, who had once shown him kindness when the rest of Redemption Springs had turned its back. Or perhaps, after 15 years of solitude, some part of him hungered for human connection, despite his best efforts to extinguish that need. Whatever the reason, he had made his choice, and now both their fates were intertwined. Shouldering his pack, Caleb locked the cabin door and set off toward the hunting shelter where Eleanor waited, moving with the silent grace of a man long accustomed to the wilderness. Eleanor paced the confined space of the hunting cabin, anxiety building with each passing hour. The structure was little more than a single room, with a small fireplace, a narrow cot, and shelves lined with preserved food and hunting supplies. Through the single window, she watched as the afternoon sky darkened with approaching storm clouds, amplifying the gloom inside the primitive shelter. Her thoughts raced between concern for Caleb Morgan's safety and fear for her own future. Had the sheriff believed his denials? Would they search further up the mountain? And most troubling of all, what would happen when winter truly set in? She had acted impulsively, driven by desperation, but now the reality of her situation was setting in. She was miles from civilization, dependent on the goodwill of a man who was himself a mystery. The sound of approaching footsteps sent her heart racing. She grabbed the pistol Caleb had given her, moving to position herself beside the door, out of sight of anyone entering. The footsteps paused outside, followed by 3 short knocks, a signal they hadn't arranged. Eleanor held her breath, finger poised near the trigger. "Miss Hargrove, it's Morgan," came the familiar rumbling voice from outside. "You can lower that pistol now." There was a hint of dry humor in his tone that caught her by surprise. Eleanor quickly unbarred the door, relief washing over her as Caleb's massive frame filled the entrance. "How did you know I was armed?" she asked, setting the pistol aside. The question died on her lips as she noticed his grim expression. "What happened? Did they believe you?" Caleb stepped inside, ducking to clear the low doorframe. He dropped his pack on the small table, his movements efficient and purposeful. Hollister and Wilson might have. Sullivan didn't. At Eleanor's questioning look, he explained, "Thomas Sullivan works for your father. We have history." The understatement hung in the air between them. Sullivan was with them? Eleanor's face paled slightly. "He's dangerous, Mr. Morgan. My father uses him when legal means aren't sufficient." She had never approved of Sullivan's employment at the ranch, but her father valued his unquestioning loyalty and willingness to use force when necessary. Caleb nodded grimly. "I'm well acquainted with Sullivan's character." He began transferring items from his pack to a smaller one that had been hanging on the cabin wall. "Which is why we need to move. This place isn't safe anymore. Sullivan knows these mountains better than most. He'll double back once he's separated from the sheriff." Eleanor watched him work, noting the practiced efficiency of his movements. "Where will we go?" she asked, trying to keep the apprehension from her voice. The idea of venturing even deeper into the wilderness, with winter approaching, sent a shiver of fear through her. "There's a valley, about a day's journey from here," Caleb explained, not pausing in his preparations. "It's sheltered from the worst of the winter storms, with a natural hot spring that keeps it warmer than the surrounding areas. I have a small shelter there for winter hunting." He glanced up, catching her worried expression. "It's not comfortable, but it's safe, and nearly impossible to find if you don't know it's there." Eleanor nodded, squaring her shoulders. "I'll be ready in a minute." She moved to gather her few belongings, determined not to show fear. Whatever hardships lay ahead, they were preferable to the future her father had planned for her. As she packed, a question that had been nagging at her since their first conversation resurfaced. "Mr. Morgan," she began hesitantly, "earlier you mentioned my mother. You said this wasn't your first encounter with my family. What did you mean by that?" Caleb's movements stilled for a moment, his expression growing distant. "That's a story for another time, Miss Hargrove." He secured his pack and shouldered it with ease. "Right now, our priority is reaching the valley before nightfall and before Sullivan picks up our trail. Are you ready?" Eleanor recognized the deliberate change of subject, but chose not to press the issue. Whatever connection existed between Caleb Morgan and her family, it was clearly a sensitive topic. She nodded, securing her own much smaller pack. "I'm ready." They left the hunting cabin, Caleb taking a moment to obscure any signs of their presence. The sky had darkened further, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall as they set off on a barely visible game trail leading higher into the mountains. Eleanor found herself struggling to keep up with Caleb's long strides, but she refused to complain. The mountain hermit had risked his peaceful existence to help her. The least she could do was match his determination with her own. As they climbed higher, the rain intensified, driven by a rising wind that bent the pine trees around them. Eleanor was soon soaked to the skin, despite the oilskin coat Caleb had provided. Her feet, encased in riding boots never intended for such terrain, began to blister painfully. Still, she pressed on, gritting her teeth against the discomfort. Caleb, for his part, moved with the assurance of a man intimately familiar with the landscape. Occasionally, He would pause to check their surroundings or to allow Eleanor to catch her breath, but he never suggested turning back or seeking shelter from the worsening storm. Time was clearly of the essence, and comfort a luxury they could not afford. After nearly 2 hours of difficult travel, they crested a ridge that offered a momentary view of the valley below through breaks in the clouds. Eleanor caught her breath at the sight. From this height, Redemption Springs looked impossibly small and distant, a collection of toy buildings nestled in the valley floor. The life she had known, the future that had been planned for her, seemed equally diminished by distance and perspective. "We need to keep moving," Caleb urged, his voice nearly lost in a gust of wind. "The valley is still several hours away, and this storm is getting worse." He pointed toward a narrow pass between two towering rock formations. "That's our route. The trail gets steeper from here, but it's the only way through." Eleanor nodded, too breathless to respond verbally. As they continued their ascent, the terrain became increasingly treacherous. The rain had turned the trail slick with mud, and twice Eleanor nearly lost her footing on exposed rocks. Each time, Caleb's hand shot out to steady her, his grip firm but surprisingly gentle for a man of his size. They had just entered the narrow pass when a sound carried to them on the wind, the distant but unmistakable whinny of a horse. Caleb froze, his body tensing as he scanned the trail below. Eleanor followed his gaze, her heart sinking as she spotted a lone rider making his way up the same path they had traveled. "Sullivan," Caleb confirmed grimly. Even at this distance, the tracker's determined posture was recognizable. "He's moving faster than I expected." He considered their options quickly, his expression hardening as he made a decision. "The pass narrows ahead. There's no way around it, but it's defensible. We need to reach it before he catches up to us." Fear gave Eleanor a fresh surge of energy as they increased their pace, practically running now, despite the dangerous conditions. The narrow pass soon constricted further, hemmed in by sheer rock walls on either side. At its narrowest point, barely wide enough for a single person to pass through, Caleb stopped. "Wait here," he instructed, helping Eleanor find secure footing on a small ledge just off the trail. "Don't move, no matter what you hear." He unslung the rifle from his shoulder, checking that it was loaded and protected from the rain. "What are you going to do?" Eleanor asked, fear evident in her voice. Despite Sullivan's reputation, she had never imagined their flight would lead to violence. Caleb's expression was grim but resolute. Try to convince him to turn back. He positioned himself where the pass narrowed, partially concealed by an outcropping of rock. But be prepared to run if things go wrong. The trail continues through the pass and then forks. Take the right fork. It leads to the hot spring valley. You'll see smoke from the spring's vents. Head for it. Eleanor wanted to protest, to insist they continue together, but the determined set of Caleb's jaw told her argument would be futile. She nodded reluctantly, pressing herself against the rock wall as Caleb moved into position. The minutes that followed stretched like hours, filled only with the sound of rain and wind. Then came the slow clop of hooves on stone, as Sullivan guided his horse carefully through the treacherous pass. Eleanor held her breath, pressing deeper into the shadow of the rock wall. Sullivan came into view gradually, his hat pulled low against the rain, a rifle resting across his saddle. He was scanning the trail ahead intently, apparently unaware of Caleb's presence until the mountain man stepped into view, his rifle leveled at Sullivan's chest. "That's far enough. Sullivan?" Caleb called out, his voice carrying despite the storm. "Turn back now, and we can both pretend this never happened." Sullivan reined his horse to a stop, his face twisting into a smile that held no warmth. "Morgan," he acknowledged, making no move to retreat or lower his own weapon. "Figured you'd be up this way." Judge Hargrove's mighty upset about his daughter going missing, offering a substantial reward for her safe return. "She's not here," Caleb replied evenly, though both men knew it was a lie. "Go back to town, Sullivan. This isn't gonna end well for you otherwise." Sullivan's cold smile widened. "Always the protector, aren't you, Morgan? Even after all these years." His voice dripped with contempt. "I know about you and Sarah Hargrove. The whole town did, back then." "Does her daughter know who you really are? What you did during the war?" Eleanor froze at the mention of her mother's name. Sarah Hargrove had died when Eleanor was 14, taking whatever secrets she held to her grave. What connection could she possibly have had to this mountain hermit? Caleb's expression didn't change, but his finger tightened almost imperceptibly on the rifle's trigger. "Last warning, Sullivan. Turn around and ride back down the mountain. Tell the judge his daughter wasn't here." Sullivan made a show of considering the offer, then slowly shook his head. "Can't do that, Morgan. Judge is paying too well." In a sudden movement, he swung his rifle toward where Eleanor was hidden. "Come on out, Miss Hargrove. Your father's mighty worried about you." What happened next unfolded with shocking speed. Caleb fired, his shot striking the rock just inches from Sullivan's head. A warning, not an attempt to kill. Sullivan responded by firing his own rifle, the bullet grazing Caleb's arm. The mountain man didn't flinch, moving forward with surprising speed for a man his size, closing the distance before Sullivan could chamber another round. In an instant, Caleb had dragged Sullivan from his saddle, the two men crashing to the ground in a furious struggle. Despite Sullivan's reputation as a fighter, he was clearly outmatched by Caleb's raw power. Within moments, the tracker was pinned beneath the larger man, gasping for breath as Caleb's forearm pressed against his throat. "I should end you right here," Caleb growled, his face inches from Sullivan's. "For Sarah. For all the others you've hurt on Hargrove's orders." His arm pressed harder, causing Sullivan to choke and struggle. Eleanor emerged from her hiding place, shocked by the violence unfolding before her. "Mr. Morgan, don't!" she called out, her voice barely audible above the storm. "He's not worth it." Something in her voice seemed to reach Caleb. The killing rage that had overtaken him receded slowly, and he eased the pressure on Sullivan's throat. With methodical precision, he disarmed the tracker, tossing his weapons over the edge of the cliff. Then he bound Sullivan's hands with the man's own belt. "You're lucky, Sullivan," Caleb said, his voice cold as the mountain wind. "The woman has more mercy than I do." He hauled the tracker to his feet, pushing him toward his horse. "Get on. You're going back down the mountain." Sullivan, still gasping for breath, glared at them both with undisguised hatred. "This isn't over, Morgan. The judge won't stop looking for his daughter, and I won't forget this." Despite his predicament, there was no fear in his eyes, only calculating malice. "I'm counting on your memory being good," Caleb replied evenly. "Remember this. If you or anyone else comes up this mountain after us again, I won't be so merciful." He helped Sullivan mount his horse, then slapped the animal's flank, sending it back down the trail. "Tell Judge Hargrove his daughter is safe, and tell him who's protecting her," He'll understand. They watched as Sullivan disappeared down the trail, the sound of his horse's hooves eventually fading into the background noise of the storm. Only then did Caleb turn to Eleanor, his expression unreadable. "We need to move quickly now. Sullivan will be back with more men as soon as he can." Eleanor nodded, still shaken by what she had witnessed. As they resumed their journey through the pass, the question that had been building inside her finally burst forth. "What did Sullivan mean about you and my mother? How did you know her?" Caleb was silent for so long that Eleanor thought he might ignore the question entirely. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Your mother saved my life once. After the war, when I came back, broken. The town wanted me gone, afraid of what I'd become, what I'd done." His gray eyes met hers briefly, filled with memories. "Sarah tended my wounds when no one else would, stood up to your father when he wanted me run out of town, or worse." Eleanor struggled to reconcile this information with what she knew of her mother, a gentle, proper woman who had always seemed content in her role as a judge's wife. "Why would she do that?" she asked, trying to understand. "How did she even know you?" A ghost of a smile touched Caleb's lips. "We grew up together, before your father came to town, before the war changed everything." The smile faded as quickly as it had appeared. Sarah had a way of seeing the good in people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves anymore. He fell silent again, clearly unwilling to elaborate further. They continued in silence, each lost in their own thoughts as the trail climbed higher through the mountains. The rain eventually subsided, giving way to a heavy mist that clung to the rocky slopes. By late afternoon, they had reached a high ridge that overlooked a small, sheltered valley nestled between towering peaks. "There," Caleb pointed, his voice softer than Eleanor had heard it before. The Hot Spring Valley. Below them, wisps of steam rose from various points in the valley floor, creating an otherworldly atmosphere as they mingled with the mist. A small log structure was barely visible among a grove of pine trees near the largest of the springs. Eleanor stared in wonder at the hidden paradise. Despite the extreme elevation, the valley floor was surprisingly green, protected from the harsh mountain weather by the surrounding peaks and warmed by the thermal activity below. "It's beautiful," she breathed, fatigue momentarily forgotten. Caleb nodded, a hint of pride in his expression. "It's my true home. The cabin below is just for trading and keeping an eye on what's happening in the valley. This is where I come when winter sets in." He started down the steep path that led to the valley floor. "Come on, we'll be safe here, at least for now." As they descended into the valley, Eleanor found herself wondering what other secrets this mountain giant might be harboring, and what connection he might have to her own past and future. For now, though, the promise of shelter and safety was enough. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but she had already come further than she had dared hope when she fled her father's house just a day earlier. The mountain had offered her refuge, just as it had for Caleb Morgan 15 years before. Whether it would continue to protect them both remained to be seen. The following week passed in a blur of activity as Eleanor adjusted to life in the hidden valley. The shelter Caleb had built was surprisingly comfortable. A small but sturdy log cabin with a stone fireplace, a separate sleeping area partitioned by a heavy curtain, and shelves stocked with provisions that would last through winter. The proximity to the hot springs provided not only warmth, but also a natural bathing area that Eleanor quickly came to appreciate after the rigors of their journey. Caleb proved to be a patient teacher, showing Eleanor how to identify edible plants, set snares for small game, and preserve food for the coming months. She discovered that her upbringing as a judge's daughter had left her woefully unprepared for survival in the wilderness. But what she lacked in experience, she made up for in determination and quick learning. For his part, Caleb seemed to be adjusting to company after years of solitude. His initial gruffness gradually gave way to a quiet companionability that surprised them both. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Eleanor reading aloud from one of the books Caleb had brought from his main cabin, while he worked on carving or repairing equipment. On the 8th day, as they sorted through wild berries they had gathered that morning, Eleanor finally gathered the courage to ask the question that had been weighing on her mind. "Mr. Morgan, what happened between you and my father? Why does he hate you so much?" Caleb's hands stilled, his expression growing distant. For a moment, Eleanor thought he would refuse to answer, as he had so many times before when she probed into his past. But something had shifted between them during their time in the valley. A tentative trust had formed, fragile but real. "Your father doesn't hate me," Caleb finally said, his deep voice unusually soft. "He fears me, what I represent, what I know." He met her gaze directly. Emmett Hargrove wasn't always the powerful judge he is now. When I returned from the war, he was just beginning his rise to power. Building alliances, eliminating opponents, some through legal means, others. He left the implication hanging. Eleanor frowned, struggling to reconcile this description with the father she knew. Judge Hargrove was stern and unyielding, certainly, but she had never considered him corrupt. "What does that have to do with you, or with my mother?" Caleb sighed, setting aside the berries he had been cleaning. "Your mother and I were close before the war, before she married your father." He spoke carefully, measuring each word. "When I enlisted, Sarah promised to wait, but the war dragged on, and news came that I had been killed at Shiloh. Your father courted her, offered stability and position. By the time I returned home 3 years later, they were married, and you were a small child." Eleanor's heart raced as she processed this revelation. You and my mother were in love? The concept seemed impossible, yet it explained so much. The wistful expression Sarah would get when she thought no one was watching. The way she sometimes gazed toward the mountains from their parlor window. Caleb nodded slowly. We were going to be married, had it all planned out. A shadow of old pain crossed his weathered features. But the war changes people. I came back, different, damaged. The things I'd seen, the things I'd done as an army surgeon, they haunted me. Maybe it was better that Sarah had moved on, found a life with your father. His large hands curled into fists, then relaxed with visible effort. But she was unhappy. I could see it, even if no one else could. What happened? Eleanor pressed, sensing they were approaching the heart of the matter. Why did you leave town? Come up here to live alone? Caleb's gray eyes darkened with memory. Your father had me arrested, claimed I was threatening his family, that I was dangerous, unstable from the war. He was partially right. I was struggling, having nightmares, outbursts. He gestured to his surroundings. But I never threatened anyone. Sarah knew that. She helped me escape from the jail before they could ship me off to an asylum. Gave me supplies, money to start over. Made me promise to find peace, even if it had to be away from civilization. Eleanor sat in stunned silence, trying to absorb this new understanding of her parents' marriage and her mother's past. Did my father know that she helped you? If he did, he never let on, Caleb replied. Your mother was clever, always was. She covered her tracks well. A ghost of a smile touched his lips before fading. The last time I saw her was at the edge of town, just before dawn. She made me swear to stay away for both our sakes, since she had you to think of now. The pieces were falling into place in Eleanor's mind. Her mother's quiet sadness, her father's insistence on controlling every aspect of their lives, his particular bitterness whenever the mountain hermit was mentioned in town. And all these years, you've kept your promise, stayed away. Caleb nodded, his expression solemn. Until you showed up on my doorstep, the image of your mother at your age. He studied her face, seeing the resemblance that clearly haunted him. I couldn't turn you away, not Sarah's daughter. Eleanor's throat tightened with emotion. Do you think she would have approved of you helping me escape an unwanted marriage? It suddenly seemed critically important to know. A genuine smile spread across Caleb's face, transforming his rugged features. Sarah? She would have been the first one to saddle your horse. His expression grew serious again. Your mother believed in choosing your own path, Eleanor. It was a choice she never fully had herself. They fell into contemplative silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the small cabin. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, dusting the valley in a pristine white blanket that would soon deepen into winter's full embrace. The world beyond the mountains seemed impossibly distant now, as if Redemption Springs and all it represented existed in another lifetime. What happens when spring comes? Eleanor finally asked, voicing the question that had been building since their arrival in the valley. Sullivan knows you're helping me. My father won't give up easily. Caleb considered the question, his expression thoughtful. By spring, things will have changed. Your father's arrangement with Wellington will have fallen through. Perhaps his anger will have cooled. He shrugged his massive shoulders. Or perhaps you'll have decided you're ready for a different life entirely. The choice will be yours, Eleanor. I won't keep you here if you want to return. The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within Eleanor. Throughout her life, choices had been made for her. By her father, by society's expectations, by circumstance. Here, in this hidden valley with this enigmatic man who had once loved her mother, she was being offered the freedom to determine her own future. What if I choose to stay? The question slipped out before she could consider its implications. Not just until spring, but longer? She felt a blush rise to her cheeks, suddenly aware of how her words might be interpreted. Caleb studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. This is a hard life, Eleanor. Isolated, demanding. It's not what your mother would have wanted for you. His voice was gentle, but firm. I didn't help you escape one cage just to trap you in another, no matter how beautiful the view. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. I'm not suggesting, I know you loved my mother. I'm not trying to... She stumbled over her words, embarrassed by her own presumption. I only meant that I felt more free here in 1 week than I ever did in town. Like I can breathe for the first time. Understanding softened Caleb's weathered features. The mountains have that effect. They strip away pretense, leave only what's essential. He rose from his seat, moving to stoke the fire. Spring is a long way off. You have time to decide what you want your life to be. For now, we focus on surviving the winter. As if to emphasize his point, the wind outside intensified, driving snow against the cabin windows in swirling patterns. Eleanor nodded, accepting the wisdom in his words. Whatever future awaited her beyond this valley could wait until the thaw. For now, she had found sanctuary, not just from her father's plans, but from a world that had never truly allowed her to discover who she was meant to be. Later that night, as Eleanor lay in her bed listening to the wind howl outside, she found herself thinking of her mother. Had Sarah Hargrove looked up at these same mountains every day of her married life, wondering about the man who lived among them? Had she regretted her choice, or had she found peace in the life she built with Judge Hargrove? Eleanor would never know the full truth of her mother's heart. But perhaps, in choosing her own path, she was honoring Sarah's memory more than she could have imagined. With that comforting thought, she drifted into sleep, dreaming not of Redemption Springs or the life she had left behind, but of the vast, unexplored possibilities that stretched before her, as boundless as the mountain sky. As winter tightened its grip on the high country, the rhythm of life in the hidden valley settled into a pattern of simple but demanding tasks. Each day brought new challenges and small triumphs as Eleanor adapted to mountain life under Caleb's patient guidance. She learned to maintain the fire through the night, to make snowshoes from willow branches and rawhide, to identify animal tracks in fresh snow, and to navigate by landmarks when visibility was poor. For his part, Caleb seemed to come alive during these winter months, as if the season's harsh beauty resonated with something deep within him. He moved through the snow-covered landscape with the quiet confidence of someone completely at home in an environment most would find hostile. His initial reserve gradually gave way to a more relaxed demeanor, occasionally even sharing stories from his time as an army surgeon or his childhood in the mining camp that would eventually grow into Redemption Springs. One evening, as a particularly fierce blizzard raged outside, they sat by the fire while Caleb taught Eleanor how to repair a torn snowshoe. His large hands, surprisingly dexterous for their size, demonstrated the intricate weaving pattern, while Eleanor watched intently. "You're a natural teacher," she observed, accepting the partially repaired snowshoe as he passed it to her. "Ever think about going back to medicine? There's always need for doctors, even in small towns." Caleb's expression grew distant, his hands stilling momentarily. "Medicine and I had a falling out during the war," he said quietly. "Saw too many men die under my hands. Too many I couldn't save, no matter what I tried." He shook his head, as if clearing away the memories. "Besides, Redemption Springs already has a doctor, Frederick Whitman. Good man, from what I hear." Eleanor nodded, recognizing the deflection for what it was. Dr. Whitman is nearly 70 now. Hands shake so badly he can barely write a prescription, let alone perform surgery. She continued the repair work, careful to match Caleb's technique. "The town's growing. Railroads coming. They could use someone with your skills." A humorless chuckle escaped Caleb as he rose to add another log to the fire. "You've got quite an imagination, Eleanor. The town that ran me out 15 years ago, suddenly welcoming me back with open arms? Your father allowing the mountain hermit to practice medicine on his constituents?" He shook his head. "Some bridges stay burned." Eleanor frowned, setting aside the snowshoe. "People change. Towns change. Even my father might." She stopped short at Caleb's skeptical expression. "All right, maybe not my father. But you can't hide up here forever, Caleb. That's not living. That's just existing." It was the first time she had used his first name, and the familiarity hung in the air between them, changing something subtle but significant in their dynamic. Caleb seemed to notice it too, his expression softening as he settled back into his chair. "Maybe you're right," he conceded, surprising her. "Maybe I've been hiding rather than healing, using these mountains as a shield rather than a home." He studied her face in the flickering firelight. "But what about you, Eleanor? What does living look like for the judge's daughter? If not marriage to Wellington, then what?" The question caught her off guard. In the rush to escape her father's plans, Eleanor had focused entirely on what she didn't want, giving little thought to what she did want. I'm not sure," she admitted. "I've always loved books, learning, thought about teaching, but Father said it wasn't a suitable occupation for a Hargrove." "You'd make a fine teacher," Caleb observed. "Got the patience for it." And the kindness. There was genuine appreciation in his voice, making Eleanor blush slightly. "Maybe I could start a small school," she mused, warming to the idea. "Not in Redemption Springs, but somewhere new. Somewhere I could be Eleanor, not Judge Hargrove's daughter." The possibility seemed increasingly appealing the more she considered it. "I have a small inheritance from my mother. Not much, but enough to start over." Caleb nodded thoughtfully. "Denver's growing fast. Or there's Boulder. University Town. Might appreciate a good school." He spoke casually, but Eleanor detected something else beneath his words. Perhaps a hint of sadness at the thought of her leaving once spring arrived. Before she could respond, a sharp crack echoed through the cabin as a gust of wind drove a tree branch against the window. Both of them started, then laughed at their own jumpiness. The moment of vulnerability passed as they returned to the practical tasks at hand, but something had shifted between them. A mutual acknowledgement that their time together was temporary, a winter interlude that would eventually give way to spring and the resumption of separate journeys. As the weeks passed, the snow deepened around the cabin, sometimes burying it up to the windowsills after particularly heavy storms. During clear days, they would venture out on snowshoes, checking traps, or simply exploring the transformed landscape of the valley. Eleanor discovered a previously unknown joy in these expeditions. The exhilarating freedom of moving across pristine snow, the breathtaking beauty of sunlight refracting through ice-laden branches, the profound silence broken only by the occasional call of a winter bird or the distant rumble of a snowslide. One such day in late January, they had hiked to the far end of the valley to check a line of traps. The sky was a brilliant blue, the air so crisp it seemed to crackle with each breath. They had just turned to head back to the cabin when Caleb suddenly raised a hand, signaling Eleanor to stop. "What is it?" she whispered, instantly alert to the tension in his posture. Caleb pointed toward a ridge high above them. "Smoke, not from our chimney." His voice was low, his eyes narrowed as he scanned the mountainside. "Someone's up there, watching." Eleanor followed his gaze, her heart sinking as she spotted the thin wisp of smoke rising from behind a cluster of pines on the ridge. "Sullivan?" she asked, fear creeping into her voice, despite her efforts to remain calm. Caleb shook his head slowly. "Sullivan wouldn't light a fire where we could see it. He's smarter than that." He continued to study the ridge, his expression thoughtful. "Could be trappers, or prospectors, though no one usually comes this high in winter." They watched for several more minutes, but there was no movement visible on the ridge. Finally, Caleb gestured toward the cabin. "We should head back, stay in for a few days, keep a low profile until we know who's up there." His hand rested briefly on the rifle slung across his back, a habit born of years living in the wilderness where danger could come in many forms. That evening, as darkness settled over the valley, Eleanor found herself unable to shake the unease that had followed them home from their expedition. She stood at the window, peering out into the night, searching for any sign of light on the distant ridge. "Whoever they are, they won't try to move in this darkness," Caleb assured her, joining her at the window. "The trail down from that ridge is treacherous even in daylight." Eleanor nodded, though her worry remained. "What if it's my father? What if he sent men to find me? The weather's been clear for almost a week. They could have made it up the mountain." Caleb considered this, his expression grave. "Possible, but unlikely. Your father's influential, but even he wouldn't risk men's lives on these mountains in January." He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Try not to worry. We're safe here." But the next morning proved Caleb's confidence premature. Eleanor was preparing breakfast when a sharp knock at the cabin door froze them both in place. They exchanged alarmed glances, neither having expected visitors to find the well-hidden cabin so quickly. Caleb motioned for Eleanor to move back into the sleeping area, out of sight. He retrieved his rifle from its place by the door, checking that it was loaded before calling out, "Who's there?" "Name's Marcus Wheeler," came the reply, the voice unfamiliar to both of them. "Got a message for Miss Hargrove from town. Judge says it's urgent." Eleanor emerged from the sleeping area despite Caleb's warning gesture. "How did you find this place?" she called through the door, her voice steady despite her racing heart. There was a pause before the visitor replied. "Followed your tracks after the last snowfall. Wasn't easy, but the judge is paying good money." Another pause. "I'm alone, miss. No trap, just a message." Caleb and Eleanor exchanged looks, silently debating their options. Finally, Caleb nodded, positioning himself to one side of the door with his rifle ready. "Stand back from the door," he instructed their visitor. "Hands where I can see them when I open it." When Caleb cautiously opened the door, they found a middle-aged man standing in the snow, hands raised as instructed. He was dressed for the mountains in heavy furs, his face weather-beaten and sporting a thick beard flecked with ice. He looked more like a trapper than one of Sullivan's usual associates. "Mr. Morgan," the man acknowledged with a respectful nod. His gaze shifted to Eleanor. "Miss Hargrove, your father sent me to find you." He slowly reached inside his coat, freezing when Caleb raised his rifle. "Just getting the letter, mister. Nothing funny." Caleb nodded once, allowing the man to retrieve an envelope, which he held out toward Eleanor. She took it cautiously, noting her father's familiar handwriting on the front. The seal was unbroken. "What else did my father tell you?" Eleanor asked, making no move to open the letter immediately. "Were you instructed to bring me back by force?" Her direct question seemed to take Wheeler by surprise. "No, miss. Just to deliver the letter and bring back your reply, if you have one." He stamped his feet against the cold. "Judge was very specific. Said I wasn't to pressure you. Just deliver his message." Eleanor exchanged a skeptical glance with Caleb, who had lowered his rifle slightly, but remained vigilant. "And you tracked us through a blizzard, up a mountain, in the dead of winter, just to deliver a letter?" Her tone made it clear how implausible she found this explanation. Wheeler shrugged, his expression earnest. "20 gold eagles says I did, miss. Judge is paying top dollar for this delivery." He gestured toward the ridge where they had seen smoke the previous day. "Got my camp up there. Took me 3 tries to find this valley, and another day to locate your cabin." Caleb studied the man, his experience allowing him to read the signs of a hard journey in Wheeler's exhausted posture and frost-nipped extremities. The story, improbable as it seemed, appeared to be true. "Come in," he finally said, stepping back from the door. "Warm yourself by the fire while Miss Hargrove reads her letter." Wheeler entered gratefully, moving directly to the fireplace and extending his hands toward the flames. Eleanor moved to a corner of the cabin to read her father's letter in private, while Caleb kept a watchful eye on their unexpected visitor. The letter was brief, but stunning in its contents. Eleanor read it twice to be certain she understood her father's words. Finally, she folded it carefully and returned to the main room, her expression troubled. "My father writes that Thomas Wellington has married another," she announced, addressing both men. "Apparently, when I disappeared, he wasted no time finding a more willing bride, the daughter of a San Francisco shipping magnate." She paused, still processing the implications. "Father also writes that Sullivan suffered an accident. He felt that we will discuss my future options with more consideration for my preferences." She couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. Judge Hargrove had never been one to compromise, especially when his authority had been challenged. Wheeler, warming his hands by the fire, cleared his throat. "Judge seemed different when he hired me, miss. Subdued-like. Not how folks describe him usually." He hesitated, then added, "There's talk in town that Sullivan's death wasn't no accident. That maybe the judge had him silenced when certain dealings came to light." This revelation hung in the air between them. Eleanor recalled Sullivan's words during the confrontation on the mountain trail, his references to her father's methods, to what he'd done. Perhaps Sullivan had known too much, had become a liability once Eleanor's flight had drawn unwanted attention to the judge's affairs. "Does my father expect an immediate reply?" Eleanor asked Wheeler, her mind racing with possibilities. The news of Wellington's marriage removed the immediate threat that had driven her flight. But returning to Redemption Springs would mean re-entering her father's sphere of influence. She wasn't certain she was ready for that, regardless of his newfound willingness to discuss her future. Wheeler shook his head, said to wait as long as needed for your answer, miss. I'm paid for the time. He glanced out the window at the snow-covered valley. Though I'd appreciate not spending the entire winter up here. No offense to your hospitality, Mr. Morgan. Caleb grunted in acknowledgement, moving to pour coffee for their visitor. As he handed Wheeler the steaming cup, he asked casually, "Any other news from town worth mentioning? Been a while since we've had word from below." Wheeler accepted the coffee gratefully. "Railroad survey came through last month. Looks like the spur will reach Redemption Springs by summer." He took a careful sip. "Town's growing. New hotel being built. Talk of a proper school, too." This last bit of information he directed toward Eleanor, who couldn't hide her interest. "A school?" she repeated, meeting Caleb's gaze briefly. "Who's behind that initiative?" "Committee of Town Ladies, from what I heard," Wheeler replied. "Led by Mrs. Whitman, the doctor's wife. They're looking to hire a proper teacher by spring." He smiled at Eleanor's obvious interest. "Heard Mrs. Whitman say they need someone with refinement and education. Sounds like you might fit the bill, if you were of a mind to apply." Eleanor felt a surge of excitement at the possibility. Teaching had always been her secret ambition, one she had set aside in deference to her father's expectations. But if Redemption Springs was truly establishing a proper school, and if her father was genuinely willing to allow her more independence, she glanced at Caleb, trying to gauge his reaction to this news. His expression remained carefully neutral, but she thought she detected a hint of sadness in his gray eyes. The possibility of her return to town, to a life that wouldn't include him, was suddenly palpably real. "I'll need time to consider my response," Eleanor told Wheeler. "Perhaps you could return tomorrow." "I'll have a letter ready for my father by then." Wheeler nodded, finishing his coffee and rising to his feet. "Tomorrow it is then. I'll head back to my camp before dark." He thanked them for the coffee and warmth before departing, leaving Eleanor and Caleb alone with the weight of decisions suddenly pressing upon them. As the door closed behind Wheeler, silence filled the cabin. Eleanor stood by the window, watching their visitor make his way back up the trail toward his camp on the ridge. Caleb remained by the fire, seemingly absorbed in tending the flames, though Eleanor sensed his attention was focused on her. "You're thinking of going back," he finally said, his deep voice quiet. It wasn't a question. Eleanor turned from the window to face him. "I'm considering it," she admitted. "With Wellington married and Sullivan gone, the immediate threats have passed." She moved closer to the fire, seeking its warmth. "And if there's truly an opportunity to teach," Caleb nodded, his expression impossible to read. "It's a good fit for you, teaching." He prodded a log with the poker, sending sparks up the chimney. "And spring will be here before we know it. Trail down will be clear by April." The unspoken question hung between them. What would become of their unexpected partnership once Eleanor returned to town? The months spent together in the hidden valley had created a bond neither had anticipated. Not romance, exactly, but something equally profound. A connection forged through shared challenges, quiet conversations by firelight, and the gradual revealing of truths long buried. "What about you?" Eleanor asked, sitting across from him. "Will you stay up here? Continue as you have been?" She couldn't quite keep the hint of challenge from her voice. Caleb was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "Don't know," he finally admitted. 15 years is a long time to hide from the world. He looked up, meeting her eyes. Maybe too long. When spring finally arrived, Eleanor stood at the edge of the valley, her few possessions packed. Caleb towered beside her, his weathered face softened by the morning light. "I'll return," she promised, "whether as the new school teacher or just to visit this place that changed me forever." Caleb nodded, placing something in her hand. A small, carved wooden bear. "Your mother always said, 'We make our own cages and our own keys,'" he said softly. "You found yours." 3 months later, as Eleanor welcomed students to Redemption Springs' first proper schoolhouse, she glanced toward the mountains. There, at the edge of town, stood a familiar giant figure. Caleb had finally descended from his self-imposed exile, ready to offer his healing hands to a town that needed him, just as she had needed him when she fled to his mountain sanctuary. And sometimes, when the school day ended, they would walk together toward the mountains. Two souls who had found freedom in the most unexpected of places. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.